It looks from a distance like a festival built out of skulls, fire, and flowers. Streets fill with painted faces, giant skeletons tower over the crowd. Brass music rolls through the air, and candles flicker beside photographs of the dead. But that first impression misses the real story. Mexico's Day of the Dead is not a celebration of fear, and it is not a gloomy ritual about loss. It is one of the rare public events in the world where grief is given color, memory is given a place at the table, and death is treated not as an ending to hide from, but as a relationship the living continue to carry. And that is exactly what makes this festival different. By 2026, Dia de Muertos remains one of Mexico's most recognizable and visually powerful cultural celebrations, stretching across the country, but taking on especially dramatic form in Mexico City. Here, the broad avenue of Paseo de la Reforma becomes a moving stage of marigold orange, candlelight gold, black velvet, white face paint, and towering puppets that drift toward the Zócalo, the historic heart of the capital. Yet the festival is much bigger than one parade and much older than one city. In neighborhoods, villages, cemeteries, kitchens, and markets across Mexico, the same days are marked in different ways, each local version adding another layer to a national tradition that is both intimate and spectacular. The history behind it reaches deep into Mexico's past. Most historians agree that Day of the Dead developed through a long fusion of indigenous Mesoamerican traditions and Catholic observances introduced after the Spanish conquest. Ancient peoples in what is now Mexico already held complex beliefs and ceremonies connected to death, ancestry, and the cycles of life. Over time, those ideas blended with the Christian calendar around All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, creating the form most widely recognized now on the first days of November. So while many viewers outside Mexico see skull imagery and assume a kind of folk Halloween, the historical roots point somewhere much older and more layered, a meeting point between pre-Hispanic memory, colonial history, and living local practice. Why is it celebrated? In neutral terms, the festival centers on remembrance. For many families and communities, these days mark a time to honor relatives and loved ones who have died, to gather their photographs, favorite foods, flowers, and objects, and to create a setting in which memory becomes visible. In many places, November 1st is associated with children who have died, and November 2nd with adults, though customs vary by region. UNESCO describes the celebration as commemorating the temporary return of deceased relatives and loved ones, while Mexican cultural institutions also note that the dates align with agricultural rhythms, especially the completion of the maize cycle in many indigenous communities. So even at its most festive, the holiday is carrying several meanings at once: family remembrance, seasonal transition, community identity, and continuity between generations. And the people who celebrate it are just as diverse as the meanings behind it. In Mexico, Day of the Dead is observed by families in major cities, indigenous communities with their own distinct ritual patterns, neighborhood associations, schools, artisans, market vendors, musicians, municipal organizers, performers, and local businesses that transform entire streets into temporary stages of memory and commerce. Outside Mexico, the tradition is also carried by the Mexican diaspora, especially in the United States, where it has become an important cultural expression of identity and heritage. But inside Mexico itself, the festival still belongs first to ordinary people. Parents setting out candles, grandparents teaching children how to build an altar, bakers shaping bread at dawn, florists loading trucks with marigolds, and cemetery workers preparing paths for a night that will feel unlike any other in the year. The real story begins long before the first parade float moves. Weeks ahead of the festival, markets across Mexico begin to change color. Bundles of cempasúchil, the marigold associated with the season, start to pile up in dense orange mounds. Stacks of papel picado, the cut paper banners that flutter over streets and altars, appear in bright layers of purple, pink, yellow, and blue. Candles, clay dishes, incense burners, woven baskets, painted skulls, embroidered blouses, black hats, ribbons, and framed portraits all move into view at once, making it feel as if an entire country is quietly switching sets for a new scene. Bakeries prepare pan de muerto, the soft, often sugar-dusted bread linked to the season, while families shop for fruit, mole, tamales, chocolate, and drinks that may be placed on household altars or shared at gatherings. In workshops and homes, preparation becomes personal. Altars or ofrendas are arranged not as random decoration, but as carefully composed spaces of memory. Photographs are placed at eye level. Marigold petals may be laid in paths. Candles are set out in rows. Water, salt, bread, and favorite foods are added in many homes as symbolic offerings. Some families include clothing, toys, cigarettes, books, or tools that belong to the person being remembered. In public spaces, volunteers and cultural groups build larger installations with arches of flowers, paper skeletons, carved pumpkins, baskets of fruit, and painted backdrops. And then there is La Catrina, the elegant female skeleton now seen everywhere during the festival. Yet most people never notice this part. She did not begin as an ancient goddess or a timeless folk icon. She emerged from satirical art by José Guadalupe Posada and was later popularized further by Diego Rivera, eventually becoming one of the most recognizable visual symbols of the holiday. As the festival days arrive, the rhythm shifts from preparation to performance. In Mexico City, the morning begins with crews assembling barriers, sweeping major avenues, checking sound systems, adjusting costumes, and moving floats into position near Chapultepec. Vendors roll in carts of drinks and snacks. Makeup artists begin painting white skull faces on children and adults who wait patiently in folding chairs. Street photographers test angles against statues, trees, and the first shafts of light hitting Reforma. It still feels calm, almost ordinary, but there is tension in the air. The good kind, the kind that tells you a city is about to become something else for a few hours. Then the crowd begins to gather, and the atmosphere changes block by block. Families arrive with children in painted faces and flower crowns. Teenagers show up in tailored black suits, lace gloves, velvet dresses, and wide hats styled after Katrina imagery. Tourists line up beside locals who know exactly where the best views will be. Office workers step out for a quick look and end up staying for hours. Around them, the city's monumental architecture becomes part of the stage set. The Angel of Independence in the distance, traffic lights blinking above streams of people, banners moving in the wind, and the long corridor of the avenue turning into a river of anticipation. The waiting matters because Day of the Dead is one of those events where the mood builds slowly enough that you can feel the scale of it before anything actually begins. When the parade opens, it does not feel like a single performance. It feels like many Mexicos moving at once. The now famous Mexico City route typically begins near the Puerta de los Leones in Chapultepec and travels along Paseo de la Reforma, through Avenida Juarez and toward the Zócalo. Drums arrive first, then dancers, then giant puppets, then skeletal figures in impossible costumes, then floats carrying scenes built from flowers, candles, masks, and painted history. The effect is not just colorful, it is layered. Some sections feel carnivalesque, with explosive movement and oversized visual humor. Others feel slower and more ceremonial, drawing on regional clothing, indigenous motifs, funeral music, and altar imagery. What makes the experience powerful is that spectacle and remembrance are not separated. They move together in the same procession. Look closely at the costumes, and the festival starts revealing its vocabulary. White face paint is shaded with dark circles around the eyes and delicate black lines at the mouth to suggest a skull, but the styling can range from simple to astonishingly detailed. Some faces are finished with rhinestones, gold leaf, sequins, or painted tears. Dresses mix lace, satin, embroidery, feathers, and stiff petticoats that move like theater curtains. Men wear charro-inspired jackets, top hats, tailored suits, military looks, or regional dress transformed by skeletal makeup. Flower crowns frame faces in orange and fuchsia. Children carry miniature coffins, candles, marigold bouquets, or toy skeletons. Performers lift banners painted with saints. Saints turn neutral folk art, comic skeletons, and historical references. And everywhere, bones are stylized rather than grotesque. They are designed to be witty, elegant, even playful, which changes the entire emotional tone of the event. The flowers deserve their own scene, because in visual terms, they do half the storytelling. Cempasúchil, with its deep orange color and dense petals, is so central to the season that whole streets can look dusted in flame. Petals are scattered across sidewalks and altar steps. Bouquets are tied to railings and placed beside portraits. Arches of marigolds frame entrances, while the air fills with the mixed scent of flowers, food, and candle wax. According to widely shared tradition, the color and fragrance help guide the dead toward the offerings made for them. Nearby, candles add another layer of meaning, turning public plazas into spaces that feel softer and more intimate as daylight fades. None of this is random decoration. Each object helps create a route, a welcome, or a remembered presence. And then there is the sound, which keeps the whole documentary moving. Brass bands cut through the avenue with bright, sharp energy. Drums create the pulse that holds the parade together. In some settings, traditional funeral or commemorative music can be heard. In others, the mood lifts into brass-heavy street celebration, folk songs, and crowd chants. Vendors call out over the music. Children laugh. Camera shutters click. Plastic cups rattle. Somewhere, a grill hisses with meat or corn. At the edges of the procession, food stalls anchor the experience back to the body and the street. Pan de muerto, tamales, atole, esquites, tacos, candied pumpkin, hot chocolate, and seasonal sweets shaped like skulls or bones. The result is intensely human. It is impossible to separate the symbolic from the sensory, because remembrance here is expressed through smell, taste, texture, and noise as much as through ritual form. By the time the procession nears its peak, the city feels transformed. Reforma becomes a moving gallery of giant Katrinas, illuminated floats, smoke effects, dancers in synchronized waves, and performers towering above the crowd on stilts. Cameras rise overhead, children sit on shoulders. The late afternoon sun turns the marigolds richer, the makeup sharper, and the black costumes deeper. Then the route funnels toward the historic center, where the Zocalo often serves as the final emotional payoff. With a large public altar already installed there, the parade's closing does more than end the show. It redirects attention from movement to memory, from the thrill of spectacle back to the quieter idea that the dead are being named, pictured, fed, and remembered. But there is another side to this story, because the most intimate scenes often begin after the biggest public images are over. As evening settles, Day of the Dead in Mexico divides into different worlds. In the capital, plazas glow and crowds continue to drift through public installations. In other places, especially towns known for strong local traditions, the mood turns more inward. Cemeteries fill with families cleaning graves, placing flowers, lighting candles, arranging food, and sitting together for hours. In some communities, people keep vigil through the night. The visual contrast is extraordinary. One part of the celebration is urban and expansive, built for avenues, cameras, and civic scale. Another is close, quiet, and local, lit by small flames and private conversation. This is why it is misleading to reduce Day of the Dead to the parade alone. The parade is the most visible face of the festival, but the emotional center still lives in houses, cemeteries, and community memory. Some of the most interesting details are the ones casual viewers miss. One is that the giant public parade so strongly associated with Mexico City today is actually recent. International attention exploded after the opening sequence of the 2015 James Bond film Spectre imagined an enormous Day of the Dead parade in the capital. The city then staged a real major parade in 2016, and it has grown into a defining urban event ever since. Another lesser-known fact is that the holiday, recognized around the world as a national symbol, is also officially valued for its indigenous roots. UNESCO placed the indigenous festivity dedicated to the dead on its representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity in 2008. And another detail, often overlooked, is that historical and anthropological accounts show the observance can vary significantly by region, with some communities distinguishing the dead by age, circumstance, or social role when assigning remembrance. So the festival may look unified from outside, but inside Mexico, it is a mosaic. That complexity helps explain why the festival still matters so much in modern Mexico. It is a major tourism draw, especially in places like Mexico City and Oaxaca, and it supports florists, bakers, costumers, makeup artists, guides, transport workers, hotel staff, musicians, market sellers, and artisans who depend on the season's economy. Local governments promote parades and public art because they bring revenue and global attention. But if that were the whole story, the event would feel hollow, and it doesn't. The reason it continues to resonate is that it also gives communities a language for identity. Schools build ofrendas. Young people paint their faces and post the images online, but they also learn family names and stories through the process. Designers reinterpret old symbols. Musicians blend traditional forms with new performance styles. Families who no longer live near ancestral towns still recreate the altar at home. Heritage survives here not by freezing in time, but by staying usable. There is, of course, a tension inside all of this. The more famous Day of the Dead becomes internationally, the more it risks being flattened into a single aesthetic. Skull makeup, flowers, a few dramatic photos, and a parade clip on social media. But the deeper truth is more demanding and more interesting. The festival asks people to remember specific individuals, to cook specific foods, to retrieve specific objects, to return to graves, to decorate homes, to tell stories about people who are no longer physically present, and to do that work every year. That is why even the most photogenic scenes carry emotional weight. Under the face paint and costume fabric, under the giant puppets and public choreography, this remains a festival built around the stubborn act of remembering by name. And maybe that is the most striking thing about Day of the Dead in Mexico in 2026. In a world that often pushes death out of sight, this festival does the opposite. It brings memory into the street. It sets a table for absence. It turns mourning into craft, color, food, music, and shared space. By morning, you see workers laying petals and adjusting banners. By afternoon, the city becomes a moving theater of skeletons and song. By night, the lights soften, the crowds thin, and the meaning settles in. What looked at first like a carnival of the dead reveals itself as a living conversation between generations, not a denial of loss, and not a performance of fear, but a reminder that culture can hold sorrow without hiding it, and can answer death not only with silence, but with flowers, bread, light, and the decision to remember.
Hey there, and welcome back. If you're getting cozy right now, maybe the lights are low, you've got something warm nearby. Good. Because tonight's story is one of those that works best when you are still, when the world outside has gone quiet. Tonight, we're going somewhere far away, not just in distance, but in time. Imagine this. You need to get from London to Edinburgh, about 400 minutes. You wake up before sunrise. You pack a single bag because that is all the space you have. And you climb into a wooden box on wheels. That wooden box will carry you bumping and lurching for the next 10 to 14 days. Not hours, days. You will sleep sitting upright. You will eat cold food at roadside stops. You will share that rattling wooden box with strangers who may or may not have bathed recently. And honestly, in the 18th century, the answer was usually not recently. And at the end of it all, if you survive the roads, the weather, and possibly a robbery, you will have arrived. Congratulations. You just traveled by Stagecoach. So the next time your flight gets delayed by 45 minutes, and you feel personally victimized, just remember this story. Here is something that I find genuinely astonishing about the 18th century. Most people, ordinary working people, never traveled more than 20 or 30 miles from the place they were born. Their entire world fit inside a small radius. The village, the nearby market, town, maybe a city if they were lucky. That was it. That was life. And I do not say that to be dramatic. That is just the reality of a world before engines, before speed, before the idea that you could simply go somewhere and arrive the same day. Travel was not a weekend plan in 1700. Travel was an undertaking, something you thought about for months, saved money for, prayed over, and told your family about, as if you were going to war because, statistically speaking, the risks were not entirely different. The stagecoach changed that slowly, imperfectly, sometimes dangerously, but it changed it. The word stage in stagecoach comes from the idea of traveling in stages. You did not just point the horses toward a destination and go. Every 10 to 15 m or so, The coach would stop at a prearranged inn, change the exhausted horses for fresh ones, and then move on. Stage by stage, town by town, the journey continued. It was in a sense the relay race of transportation, and understanding that rhythm, that stop and go, that almost musical cadence of the journey is key to understanding what travel actually felt like in this era. The first recorded stagecoach route in Britain launched in 1610, connecting Edinburgh to the nearby port town of Leith. A modest beginning. By 1658, there was a fortnightly coach running all the way between London and Edinburgh, a journey that would cost you $4, which in modern value is somewhere close to $400 or more. Not cheap, not accessible to everyone, but it existed. The connection existed. And in the mid-7th century, the journey between London and Edinburgh was considered reasonable at 14 days. 14 days. Think about that number. Today, a flight between those two cities takes about 1 hour and 20 minutes. A train takes about 4 hours. But in 1750, 14 days was not considered slow. It was considered organized. It was considered progress. 1712, Edinburgh to London, service advertised that it would complete the whole journey in 13 days without stoppages, if God permits, with 80 able horses to perform the whole journey. 80 horses for one route, and even then they felt the need to add that caveat about divine permission, which tells you everything you need to know about how reliable the whole enterprise actually was. That phrase, "if God permits," showed up in coaching advertisements more than once, and I think it reflects something important about how people related to travel back then. It was not assumed to go well. Risk was baked into the experience. You packed your things, you said your goodbyes, and you handed the outcome over to Providence. That is a very different psychology than the one most of us carry today, where we assume that getting somewhere is automatic and only the delay is the problem. Now, here's what I want you to understand before we dive deeper into this world. The stagecoach was not just a vehicle, it was an entire civilization built around movement. Think of it like the internet of its day, but made of horses and mud and lantern light instead of fiber optic cables and servers. The stagecoach network connected cities. It moved letters and newspapers and packages. It carried merchants and lawyers and politicians, and occasionally people running away from something. It generated thousands of jobs: drivers, owers, innkeepers, horse breeders, blacksmiths, harness makers, road builders. Entire towns existed primarily because a coach route ran through them. At its height, coaching inns kept fresh teams of horses in constant readiness, and the most skilled ostlers could change a mail coach team in as little as 3 minutes. 3 minutes to UNH harness a team of 4 horses and hook up a fresh team. That is genuinely impressive. That is a pit crew in the original sense of the word, long before motor racing ever existed. And yet for all of this infrastructure, for all the horses and roads and inns and schedules, the experience of actually riding the stagecoach was by almost every account somewhere between uncomfortable and genuinely terrible. The vehicles jolted, the roads were catastrophic, the winters were brutal, and you were expected to simply endure all of it and arrive looking like a reasonable human being. Contemporary accounts make clear that the coaches were hard on the body in ways that are difficult to fully imagine today. Delicate travelers refused them entirely. One well-known English poet of the era, a man of famously anxious temperament, reportedly asked friends for their prayers before setting out on a coach journey as if preparing for something genuinely hazardous. And honestly, he was not being overdramatic. He was being honest. That detail has stayed with me since I first came across it because it humanizes something that can otherwise feel abstract. The 18th century is not just wigs and candles and fancy portraits. It was also real people with real nerves facing an experience that was genuinely uncomfortable and sometimes genuinely frightening. And they did it anyway, because the alternative was staying home forever. By the middle of the 1700s, things were beginning to change slowly but meaningfully. Coach designs were improving. Glass replaced boards and leather curtains in the windows, and eventually the vehicles were fitted with springs. A Manchester-based company launched a service in 1754 called the Flying Coach, and their advertisement is one of my favorite pieces of historical writing because of its barely contained pride. However incredible it may appear, this coach will actually, barring accidents, arrive in London in 4 days and a half after leaving Manchester. However incredible it may appear, they knew they were selling something extraordinary. 412 days to cover 180 miles was in 1754 a statement of ambition, and the qualifier barring accidents once again gives us that honest window into just how tenuous the whole thing was. What strikes me looking at all of this is how much optimism it took, not blind optimism. These people knew the roads were bad, the weather unpredictable, the coaches imperfect. They knew all of that. And still they built the routes. Still they painted names like the Defiance and the High F Flyer, and the good intent on the sides of their coaches. There is something almost noble about that. The willingness to go even when going was hard. That more than anything else is the spirit of the Stagecoach era. And it is a spirit worth understanding because, as we go deeper into this story, you're going to see it tested again and again by bad roads, brutal winters, impossible passengers, and the kind of darkness that has no streetlights in it at all. So get comfortable. We are just getting started. Because the roads themselves, the actual physical roads these coaches traveled on, are their own story. A story of mud so deep it swallowed wheels whole of winters that made grown men weep, and of one very angry British writer who called the roads of Lancashire something that I cannot quite repeat, but that you would absolutely understand. That is exactly where we are going next, so now you know why people climbed into stagecoaches. You understand the world. They lived in a world where staying still was the default, and movement was an act of courage. But here's the question that kept nagging at me when I first started researching this topic. What was the stagecoach itself actually like? Not in the paintings, not in the romantic illustrations with gleaming horses and cheerful faces, but in reality. What did it look like up close? What was the engineering behind it? And more importantly, what happened to your body after sitting inside one for 14 hours straight? Because honestly, once you understand the machine itself, everything else about stagecoach travel starts to make a whole lot more sense. The complaints, the prayers, the sheer relief people felt when they finally arrived somewhere. Let us take a good, honest look at this thing. Picture yourself standing in front of a stagecoach for the first time. The year is, say, 1740. You're in a cobblestone courtyard in London dawn, barely cracking through the fog. And there it is, your ride for the next several days of your life. The first thing you notice is the size. It is bigger than you expected and heavier looking than anything that ought to move at speed. The body is built from oak, solid, dense, unforgiving oak, bolted and jointed together into a roughly rectangular box. The roof is curved slightly to let rain run off. The whole structure sits on 4 iron-rimmed wooden wheels, the rear pair noticeably larger than the front pair. Those big rear wheels are not for aesthetics. They are engineering. A larger wheel rolls over obstacles more easily, which matters enormously when the obstacle in question is a rut the size of a small trench. Now look underneath. Without suspension, these coaches could only travel at around 5 miles an hour on the rooted tracks and unmade roads of the time. 5 miles an hour? That is barely faster than a brisk walking pace. The earliest coaches had no springs at all. The body sat directly on the axles through a system of leather straps, and every single impact from the road transferred straight up through the frame, through the seat, and into the spine of whoever was unlucky enough to be sitting inside. The introduction of steel springs into coach design came gradually through the early 18th century. A patent for improved carriage springs was registered as early as the 1690s, and further refinements followed across the following decades. These improvements were real, and they mattered. But let us be honest, even with early springs, a coach traveling over an unpaved English road in 1740 was not a comfortable experience. It was simply less terrible than it had been 20 years before. Progress in the stagecoach world was measured in degrees of suffering. Now open the door and step inside, and this is where the class system of 18th century England becomes literally physically tangible. The inside of a stagecoach usually carried between 4 and 6 passengers. Several more joined on the outside, riding exposed on the roof, the side platforms, or in the rear luggage basket. Inside seats generally cost about twice as much as those on the outside, twice the price for a box that by our standards would not pass muster as a comfortable space for even one person, let alone 6. Think about what that means. 6 people on an inside bench, 3 facing forward, 3 facing backward, your knees almost certainly touching the knees of the person across from you, your shoulder pressed against the shoulder of the person next to you. Several travelers described a situation in which there was simply no room for all 12 legs of 6 passengers to rest. Naturally, someone always ended up with a foot dangling, interlocking knees, dangling feet, and this was the comfortable, premium, twice the price experience. Now ask yourself, what was it like on the outside? The outside passengers, those who could not or would not pay for an inside seat, rode on the roof. There was a wooden rail up there, and passengers gripped it as best they could. There were no proper seats at the start, just the curved, sloping surface of the coach roof, and whatever wooden handle or rope was provided. A German traveler who visited England in the early 1780s and wrote a detailed account of his journey left behind a vivid picture of what he saw. Coaches carrying far more roof passengers than was officially permitted. People crouching and gripping in all weather. The rule said no more than 6 on the outside. The word supposed is doing a great deal of work in any sentence that describes what actually happened. This traveler himself, exhausted from crouching on the curved roof, eventually climbed down into the rear luggage basket, a compartment at the back that also doubled as a cheaper option for passengers. He reported that it was even worse than the roof. And here is the detail that for me puts the whole class divide in sharpest focus. If an outside passenger, soaking wet, half frozen, hanging off the back of a moving vehicle wanted to come inside, they could only do so if one of the inside passengers agreed to give up their seat. Your only hope was that someone richer than you felt generous enough to offer their space. I find that detail quietly devastating. Not dramatic, just a small, ordinary cruelty of the era. Now, beyond comfort or the absence of it, there is the question of weight. And weight on a stagecoach was everything. The coaches were already heavy. A fully loaded stagecoach with passengers, luggage, and mail could weigh well over a ton. Horses pulling such loads lasted an average of only 3 years before being worn out by the demands of the work. 3 years. That is not a long working life, and it tells you something about the brutal economics of the whole operation. Operators were always fighting the temptation to overload. More passengers meant more revenue. More luggage fees meant more profit. So they squeezed. They packed the roof. They filled the basket. They stacked the boots with mail bags. And the horses and the roads paid the price. There were regulations, technically. In 1783, a parliamentary bill attempted to limit the number of outside passengers, proposing that only 6 might ride on top and 2 on the box of a standard coach. The response from coachmen and operators was dismissive in the extreme, and the regulation was widely ignored. In fact, the phrase all gammon, meaning nonsense or rubbish, entered everyday British speech partly because of the contempt with which the coaching world greeted this particular piece of legislation. Language shaped by a transportation dispute. That kind of thing delights me every time. Let me ask you something. When you fly somewhere today, you have a choice economy, business, first class. The difference between them is real, but even in economy, you have a seat that resigns, a screen in front of you, and the reasonable expectation that you will land alive. In 18th century coach travel, the gap between classes was not just about comfort, it was about safety. The person on the inside, surrounded by wooden walls, had some protection if the coach lurched or tipped. The person on the roof had none, and tipping was not a remote possibility. It was on certain roads, in certain weather and expected part of the journey. The coach names themselves tell a story here. They called them things like the Defiance, the Perseverance, the Good Intent. These are not the names of things that expect smooth passage. These are the names of things being launched into difficulty. By the 1820s, when the coaching industry reached its golden era, the vehicles themselves had improved enormously. Lighter bodies, better springs, purpose-built interiors for matched horses rather than whatever could be sourced cheaply. The best coaches of this era, the Royal Mail coaches in particular, were genuinely impressive pieces of engineering, fast and relatively reliable by the standards of anything that had come before them. But that golden era was also, as we will see, very brief. The machine that took a century and a half to perfect was about to become obsolete almost overnight. Before any of that, though, before the golden era, before the mail coaches, before even the roads that made the mail coaches possible, we need to talk about the roads themselves. Because the story of what English roads were actually like in this period is genuinely one of the most extraordinary tales of infrastructure failure in modern history. And one very angry agriculturalist summed it up in terms that I find extremely satisfying. That is where we are headed next. There is a phrase I want you to hold in your mind for a moment. It comes from a prominent English agricultural writer who traveled extensively across Britain in the 1760s and 1770s and recorded what he found with the precision of a scientist and the fury of someone who has just lost a wheel to a road that had no business being called a road. He described the roads of Lancashire in language so vivid that it has survived nearly 2.5 centuries. He said the roads were so bad they could not be described, only cursed. He was not exaggerating for effect. He was reporting facts. That writer was Arthur Young, and his tours of Britain in the 1760s and 1770s produced some of the most quotable and most frustrated commentary on English infrastructure ever written. Young was not some pampered traveler who expected luxury. He was a working writer, a man who rode for professional reasons, and was perfectly willing to endure difficulty. But what he found on the main roads of England in 1770 was, by his assessment, not merely difficult. It was a national embarrassment. And he was right. Here is the thing you need to understand about English roads in the early 18th century. They were not built. They were not maintained. They were for the most part simply worn into existence by centuries of feet and wheels and hooves, and then abandoned to whatever the weather decided to do to them. The legal responsibility for road maintenance fell to the parish's local units of church governance, through a system dating back to a 1555 Act of Parliament. Each parish was theoretically responsible for maintaining the roads within its boundaries. In practice, this meant that a few times a year, local farmers and laborers were required by law to spend several days doing road repairs, using their own tools and their own time entirely without pay. They were called statute labor days, and you can probably already imagine how seriously people took work they were forced to do for free with no personal benefit. The results were predictably poor. Ruts that formed in winter were simply left to deepen. Mud that made roads impossible for weeks was not cleared. Drainage, the single most important factor in road quality, was almost entirely ignored. In wet weather, which in England is a considerable proportion of all weather main roads, became something closer to canals. In dry weather, they became something closer to dust storms. A fully loaded stagecoach on these roads in winter was an act of faith that bordered on recklessness. Wheels sank to their axles. Horses threw themselves against their harnesses and gained inches rather than yards. Coaches had to be dug out. Passengers were required to get out and walk through mud that pulled at their shoes. And this was on roads that were considered the main arteries of the country. The solution, when it finally came, did not arrive through government. It arrived through money. The turnpike system roads maintained by private trusts that charged a fee for use had existed in a small way since the 1660s, but it expanded dramatically through the 18th century. By the 1750s and 1760s, turnpike trusts controlled thousands of miles of the main roads of England and Wales. You paid a toll at a gate, the money went into the trust, and the trust theoretically at least used it to repair and maintain the road. The results were mixed. Some trusts were diligent and efficient. Others were corrupt or simply incompetent, or both. Arthur Young's travels took him across both kinds, and his verdict was clear. On a well-maintained turnpike, travel was transformed. On a poorly run one, you had simply paid extra money for the same bad road. But the idea that roads required dedicated investment and professional maintenance, not occasional reluctant labor from resentful farmers, was the right one. And when the right engineer finally got hold of it, everything changed. That engineer was John Loudon McAdam, and his contribution to the story of the stagecoach is one of those historical achievements so fundamental that we forget it was ever an innovation. McAdam was a Scottish road surveyor who had spent decades studying road construction and had arrived at a series of conclusions that ran directly against the prevailing wisdom of his day. The prevailing wisdom held that roads needed a firm foundation. Large stones, sometimes called a pavement, lay deep into the ground to provide a stable base. This was the approach associated with the engineer Thomas Telford, whose roads were impressively solid and impressively expensive. McAdam's approach was different and considerably cheaper. He argued that the real foundation of a road was the subsoil itself, the natural earth beneath the surface, and that if you kept it dry and distributed the weight of traffic evenly, it would carry any reasonable load without difficulty. What you needed on top was not deep stone pavements, but a carefully prepared layer of small broken stones. No piece larger than could fit in a person's mouth laid to a consistent depth and crowned so that rain ran off to the sides. It sounds simple. It was revolutionary. The small compacted stones locked together under the pressure of traffic, creating a surface that was firm, well-drained, and remarkably durable. It required less material than Telford's method. It was easier to repair, and when properly maintained, it allowed coaches to travel at speeds that would have been unthinkable on the roads of even a generation earlier. By the 1820s, McAdam's method had been adopted across Britain on a scale that transformed travel times almost overnight. The journey from London to Manchester, which had taken 4.5 days in 1754, when the flying coach made its famous boast, now took 26 hours. The journey from London to Edinburgh, which had taken 14 days in 1750, could now be completed in about 44 hours. Not comfortable hours, but 44 of them rather than 336. The roads had finally caught up with the ambition. But here is the thing about the turnpike revolution that I find most interesting, and that tends to get lost in the larger story. It was not just about speed, it was about reliability. Before the turnpike era, a coach operator could not meaningfully promise departure and arrival times. The road might be passable, it might not. That was genuinely unknown until you tried it. After the turnpike era, on the best road schedules became possible. In schedules, the ability to say a coach will leave at this hour and arrive at that one changed the relationship between travel and time in ways that had enormous consequences for how people organized their lives, their businesses, their expectations of the world. The Royal Mail coach system, which we will come to later, was built entirely on the back of the turnpike revolution. Without the improved roads, the mail could not have been guaranteed to arrive, and without the guarantee, the whole system of national communication that Palmer envisioned would have remained a dream. So when you think about what made the coaching era possible, what turned a collection of jolting vehicles into something that deserved to be called a transportation network, it was not just the coaches, and it was not just the horses. It was the roads underneath them. Specifically, it was one Scottish engineer with a theory about small stones and proper drainage, who in the end made the modern world's first reliable timetable possible. The roads were not the glamorous part of this story, but they were, in a very real sense, the whole foundation of it. There is a version of this story that almost nobody tells, and honestly, that surprises me every time I think about it. We spend so much time talking about the passengers, the coaches, the roads, the drama of it all. But behind every single departure, every schedule kept every mile covered in the rain, in the cold, in the dark. There was a living creature making it possible, an animal with no say in the matter, no contract, no day off, and no complaint that anyone was willing to record. The horse. And I want to give the horse its proper place in this story, because once you understand what these animals actually went through, how many there were, how hard they worked, how quickly they wore out, and who was responsible for keeping them alive, the entire stagecoach world looks completely different. Let us start with a number that tends to stop people cold when they first hear it. A single coach, route from London to Edinburgh, roughly 400 meter, required approximately 80 horses stationed along its length at any given time. 80 horses for one route, not total, not shared across the network. 80 animals just for that one corridor waiting at irons and stables, every 10 to 15 mi rested and ready to replace the exhausted team pulling in from the previous leg. And this was not a unique route. By the later 1700s, Britain had dozens of active long-distance coach routes, crisscrossing the country in every direction, north to southeast to west, connecting London to Bristol, Birmingham, Manchester, York, Liverpool, Bath. Each of those routes had its own relay system, its own string of horses, its own web of stables. By the time the coaching industry reached its peak in the 1820s and early 1830s, estimates suggest that somewhere between 150,000 and 180,000 horses were employed in the coaching trade across Britain as a whole. Let that sink in. 150,000 horses bred, trained, and worn out so that people could move between cities on a timed. Run those numbers in your head for a moment. It is genuinely staggering. Now, here is where it gets personal, because the horses themselves were not abstractions. They were individual animals bred specifically for this work, trained for it, and consumed by it. The preferred horse for coaching work was not the romantic, graceful thoroughbred you might picture. Four-bredads were for racing, built for short bursts of speed on groomed tracks. Coach horses were different. They needed stamina over elegance, power over beauty. The breeds most commonly used were heavier, sturdier animals. The Cleveland Bay was popular for its endurance, and the Yorkshire coach horse, a cross between the Cleveland Bay and the thoroughbred, became especially prized as roads improved and speed became more important than brute strength. A horse bred essentially to be both powerful and reasonably fast. Exactly what a loaded stagecoach on a muddy road demanded. But even the best-bred coach horse had limits. These animals lasted an average of only 3 years, pulling coaches at the pace the industry demanded. 3 years. After that, they were typically sold on for lighter work, for farming, for whatever use their remaining strength could serve. Some were lucky, many were not. 3 years of hard labor then replaced. That is the calculation that made the coaching industry run. The person responsible for that calculation at the inn level was the oller. And here I want to pause on the ostler, because he is one of the great unsung figures of this entire era. The word comes from the Old French for innkeeper, but by the 18th century it had narrowed to mean something specific, the man who managed the horses at a coaching inn. He oversaw the stabling, the feeding, the watering, the grooming. He knew which horses were fresh, which were tired, which had a shoe that needed checking, and which had a leg that was running hot. He was in effect the operations manager of the most time-sensitive part of the whole system. At a well-run stage, stop a complete horse change. 4 exhausted horses out, 4 fresh horses in all harness, transferred, and secured could be accomplished in under 3 minutes. 3 minutes. That is not just efficiency. That is a practice, drilled, physically demanding choreography performed dozens of times every day, at every stage, on every route. The oller had to know his horses by name and temperament. He had to coordinate with his grooms, his stable boys, his harness repairers. He had to do all of this regardless of weather, regardless of hour, because the coach did not wait. The ostler worked long hours in a physically demanding environment, cold in winter, hot in summer, always smelling of horses and hay and leather. He was not a celebrated figure in the way the coachman was. He did not get the tips, the admiration, the songs written about him. But without the ostler, the 3-minute horse change was impossible, and without the 3-minute horse change, the entire timetable was fiction. How long did a stage stop actually last? On a well-run route, not long at all, often 15 minutes or less, enough time to swap the horses, let passengers stretch their legs, perhaps grab a cup of something hot if the inn was organized about it. But on less efficient routes, or when something went wrong, a lame horse that had not been caught in time, a harness buckle that had cracked on the previous leg, a coachman who wanted his dinner and was not going to be hurried, stage stops could stretch to 30 or 40 minutes. For a coach on a schedule, it was the difference between arriving on time and arriving late, which on the mail routes could mean penalties for the operator and professional consequences for the guard. The pressure to keep moving was constant, and the horses were the limiting factor. There is one more dimension to the horse story that I think deserves a moment because it tends to get overlooked in accounts of this era, and that is the economics of horse supply. Keeping a relay system running required a constant pipeline of new animals. Horses wore out, they got lame, they died. On busy routes, a coaching company might need to replace a third of its horse stock every year just to maintain its capacity. This meant that horse breeding, horse trading, and horse dealing were not incidental industries in Georgian England. They were substantial businesses closely integrated with the coaching trade. The horse dealer and the coach proprietor had a relationship as fundamental as, say, the jet fuel supplier and the airline. One could not function without the other. And when the railways eventually ended the coaching era, one of the quiet economic catastrophes that unfolded was in exactly this supply chain. Tens of thousands of horses bred specifically for coach work suddenly had no buyers. The market collapsed. Prices fell to fractions of their former levels. Many animals ended up in uses far beneath what they'd been bred and trained for. It is in its way one of the saddest side effects of a technological revolution that the history books tend to overlook in favor of the more dramatic stories. But the horses were there through all of it, every mile, every year, every stage. And they deserve at least this much acknowledgement. Now behind the horses, behind the osters, behind the stage stops, there is another world that the journey passed through. A world of fire and food and noise, an extraordinary social complexity, the coaching in. And that, as we will see, was a civilization all by itself, right? So we have spent time with the horses, the ostlers, the roads, the coaches, and I want to stay up on that wooden box seat for a moment longer because the person sitting there holding those 4 sets of res is one of the most fascinating figures of the entire era. The coachman, not the mythologized version, not the jolly red-faced fellow in the Christmas card with the muffler and the brandy. The actual professional in his actual working life. Because when you look at that life clearly, it is considerably more interesting and considerably more complicated than the image we've inherited. Let us start with the skill. Because driving 4 horses, what the professionals called the 4-in-hand, was not simply a matter of holding res and pointing animals in a direction. It was one of the most technically demanding skills available to a person without formal education in the 18th century, and mastering it took years. When you hold 4 sets of reseurs, you're communicating with 4 different animals simultaneously, each with its own temperament, its own response to the rein, its own relationship to the horses beside it. The 2 horses closest to the coach, called the wheelers, bore most of the weight and controlled most of the braking. The 2 at the front, the leaders, had more freedom of movement and needed to be guided with a subtler hand. Getting all 4 to work as a unit to pull together evenly, to slow and turn and stop without confusion or panic, required a kind of distributed attention that experienced drivers described as almost unconscious, like thinking with your hands. Now, add to that the variable of road quality, the ruts that could throw a wheel, the steep descents where you had to apply the brake with 1 foot while keeping the horses from panicking as the coach pushed into them from behind, the narrow bridge, the blind corner, the ford that might be deeper than it looked after overnight rain. The coachman processed all of this continuously in real time at speed, often at night, often in winter. A contemporary manual on driving described it as one of the most exacting of all practical skills. The coachman had to read the road ahead, manage his horses behind him, manage the weight of his passengers and luggage behind them, watch the weather, watch the road surface, watch the horses' ears for signs of disturbance, and be able to make decisions that might mean the difference between arrival and catastrophe all at once, all the time, while sitting on a wooden box in the wind. It was in the truest sense of the word a craft, and the best practitioners of this craft were celebrated accordingly. The great coachmen of the golden era, roughly 1780 to 1840, were not merely employees. They were personalities, regional celebrities, men whose names were known along their entire route and whose arrival in a town was an event. Part of this was simply the nature of the job. The coachman sat above everyone else, literally elevated on his box seat, visible to the whole yard before departure, the figure around whom all the bustle and preparation orbited. He was the last word on whether the coach would leave. He decided who sat beside him on the box. He managed the ostler's pace during horse changes with a glance, a word, a gesture. On the road, he was in absolute command, and he knew the people along the route with an intimacy that no other figure could match. He knew the innkeepers and the ostlers by name. He knew the farmers whose fields bordered the road, the children who ran to the gate to watch him pass the old women who left things with him for delivery. He was a node in the social network of rural England, a moving post office, a carrier of news, a connecting thread in a world that otherwise had very little connection. Contemporary accounts of the coachman's role describe him as occupying a peculiar middle position in Georgian society, working ass in origin and occupation, but treated with a respect that few working men received. He was tipped generously by passengers who understood that his goodwill was worth having. He was given preferential treatment at Insem. He was talked about in affectionate terms by people who would not otherwise have much to say about a working tradesman. The coachman decided who sat beside him on the box seat. Think about that for a second. This was a working-class tradesman in a deeply hierarchical society, and he had the authority to choose his companion from among people who might be considerably above him in social rank. A merchant, a minor gentleman, a clergyman. They all wanted the box seat because it was the best ride on the coach, outside air and a view, and the fascinating experience of watching the horses worked. And if they wanted it, they had to be chosen. That is a quiet but significant inversion of the normal order of things. And yet for all of that status, a skilled coachman was well compensated by the standards of his era. A head coachman in private service could earn between $50 and $100 a year in wages, and the tips from passengers, the perquisites of the profession, the economies of the job itself could more than double that figure in practice. In an era when a skilled craftsman might earn a year, a successful coachman was genuinely prosperous. The professional conditions were, of course, rather different from the romantic image. The hours were brutal. A coachman on a long route might drive 10 or 12 hours a day in all weathers and then do it again the next day. The work was physically demanding, and in winter especially genuinely dangerous. Frostbite was a professional hazard. Coachmen who drove night stages in the depths of an English winter described conditions that were by any reasonable assessment hazardous to health. The toll this took showed in their bodies. Contemporary descriptions of experienced coachmen note a characteristic set of physical adaptations. Broad shoulders from the constant work of the reins, a particular squint from years of looking down long roads into the weather, and a posture that spoke of long hours on the box. These were not soft men. There is a figure I want to mention here, partly because he is so specific, and partly because specificity is often where history becomes real rather than abstract. His name was John Bradshaw, and he drove the Manchester-London route for over 20 years in the early 19th century. He was known for his consistency. He rarely missed a departure, rarely lost significant time to road conditions, and was reputed never to have had a serious accident. His passengers trusted him. The operators valued him. In an industry where your most important product was reliability, Bradshaw was by all accounts the product. He is not famous. He has no statue, no biography, no memorial. But in his era, on his route, the people who rode with him knew his name and felt safer for knowing it. The coachman's celebrity was local, temporary, and entirely dependent on the coach continuing to run. When the railways came, that was over. The skill that had taken a lifetime to develop became worthless in less than a decade. Some coachmen found workers' railway guards applying their sense of schedule and responsibility to the new technology. Others drifted into whatever work they could find. A few held on in the remote routes, where the railway had not yet reached driving on through the 1840s and into the 1850s in a landscape that had moved on around them. The last coachman of England worked in a world that had already forgotten what they had built. That is the melancholy at the heart of the coachman's story. Not that he failed. He was in his era among the most skilled and respected practitioners of his trade. He failed in the way that all very good things eventually fail by being replaced by something even faster, even cheaper, and entirely indifferent to what it had displaced. Something I find genuinely fascinating about the stagecoach and historians are only beginning to give it the attention it deserves, is that it did something no other institution in 18th century England quite managed. It put strangers in a box together and made them stay there. That sounds simple. It was in social terms revolutionary. Think about the world of 1750. Social interaction was highly structured. Who you talked to, who you sat with, who you ate beside, these were not casual matters. They were governed by rank, by profession, by religion, by gender, by a web of expectations so deeply internalized that most people navigated them without conscious thought. You knew your place, and your place determined who was allowed near you. The Stagecoach ignored all of that. It had 8 seats, or 12 if you counted the roof, and it sold them to whoever could pay. A merchant's widow might find herself beside a minor baronet. A lawyer heading north for the assizes might spend 48 hours in enforced proximity with a livestock dealer from the Midlands. A clergyman might share a bench with a seamstress. They had no choice in the matter. The coach was full. The door was closed, and they were going to be sitting like this until the next stage stop. That is the social experiment at the heart of the Stagecoach era, and it produced some of the most interesting and most revealing human moments in the historical record. Let us start with who was actually riding these coaches in the mid-18th century. The demographics shifted considerably over the era. In the early period, the 1650s through 1720s, coach travel was expensive enough that it was primarily used by the professional classes and above merchants, lawyers, doctors, minor gentry, government officials. The poor traveled on foot or by carrier's wagon, which was slower, cheaper, and considerably less defined by schedule. By the middle of the century, as routes multiplied and competition between operators brought prices down, the coach began to attract a wider range of passengers, tradespeople, skilled workers relocating to new positions, domestic servants traveling between houses, students making their first journey to university, young women leaving their home counties for the first time to take up employment in London or another. And on the outside seats, which cost half as much as the inside, you found an even broader range: laborers, petty traders, people for whom the coach represented a significant financial sacrifice to reach a destination they needed to reach. The English clergyman Parson James Woodford, who kept a detailed diary for nearly 4 decades in the second half of the 18th century, recorded several coach journeys with the kind of close observational detail that makes historians extremely grateful. He noted his fellow passengers, their apparent stations in life, the conversations that developed the atmosphere in the coach over hours of travel. His diary gives us a picture of the coach as a genuinely mixed social space, not comfortable for everyone, not equal for everyone, but genuinely mixed in a way that few other spaces of the era managed to be. What happened when all these different people were locked in a box together for 16 hours? Mostly surprisingly little. The historical record suggests that coach passengers developed a set of unwritten social conventions that made the experience manageable, if not always pleasant. You talked when conversation was appropriate and fell silent when it was not. You did not ask personal questions too directly. You passed food if you had it. You helped each other out of the coach at stage stops without making a production of it. An etiquette writer of the era who addressed the specific challenge of shared travel captured the spirit of it memorably. He argued that coach travel demanded above all 3 things: patience, courage, and good humor. The patience to endure discomfort without complaint. The courage, and he did use the word courage, to sit for hours in a confined space with strangers whose habits and personalities you had no way of anticipating. And the good humor to make the best of whatever the journey threw at you. The fact that a writer of social guidance thought courage was a prerequisite for sitting in a coach with strangers is honestly quite revealing about how anxiety-inducing the experience was for people who took social hierarchy seriously. being forced into equality with people above or below you in rank, not as an abstract principle, but as a physical, unavoidable reality, was genuinely unsettling for some passengers. For others, it was something quite different. Now, and this is the part that surprises most people when they first encounter it, the 18th century was not uniformly worse at navigating this kind of social mixing than we might expect. There are accounts of genuine cross-class friendships that began on coach journeys of strangers who helped each other through difficult passages of conversations that would never have happened anywhere else. The coach created a temporary quality of discomfort. Whether you had paid for the inside seat or the outside one, the road was bad for everyone. The wind found gaps in the best greatcoat. The jolting respected no rank. You got stuck in the same mud and waited for the same horses and ate the same indifferent food at the same stage stop. And there is something about shared physical difficulty that dissolves, at least temporarily, the pretensions that comfort allows. One of the most striking social patterns that historians have identified in coaching-era accounts is the tendency for passengers who would never have spoken under any other circumstances to become within the compressed social world of a long journey. Something approaching genuine acquaintances. 15 hours in a box together will do that. You run out of silence. Some passengers tried to maintain their resistance. Of course, there are accounts of wealthy travelers who hired the entire inside of a coach to ensure they would have no company paying for all 4 inside seats to guarantee solitude. This was expensive and rather conspicuous, and most people could not afford it. But it tells you that the forced sociability of the coach was not universally welcomed. There is also in the historical record a darker note. The coach was a confined space with limited oversight. Theft among passengers was not unknown. Women traveling alone were vulnerable in ways that the historical sources only hint at, and the hints are not reassuring. One of the recurring anxieties in contemporary accounts of coach travel was the unpredictability of fellow passengers, not just in terms of class, but in terms of basic safety. This is one of the reasons that well-traveled routes and reputable coach companies were worth the premium they charged. A coach from a known operator on a well-maintained route with experienced staff offered at least some protection against the worst possibilities. A cheap coach on an obscure route packed with strangers at night was a different proposition entirely. The social experiment of the stagecoach was, like most experiments, more complex and more ambiguous in practice than it sounds in theory. It was not a golden age of cross-class harmony. It was a pragmatic, sometimes fraught, sometimes surprisingly warm encounter between people who happened to need to travel in the same direction at the same time, which in its way is a pretty accurate description of most forms of public transport ever invented. Picture the scene. You've been sitting in a jolting wooden box since 5 hours in the morning. It is now early afternoon. Your back is in a state that a physician would describe with concern. The person who was sitting next to you on the outside seat fell asleep 2 hours ago and has been using your shoulder as a pillow ever since. The road has been, to use a technical term, appalling, and then ahead you see it. A broad courtyard through an arched gateway, lanterns being lit, though it is still afternoon because the light is failing fast. The smell of hay and horse and something cooking, the sound of voices, and a woman in a white apron standing in the doorway with a particular expression of someone who has managed this precise situation 1,000 times and is perfectly capable of managing it 1,000 times more. You've arrived at the coaching inn, and for the next hour or the next 12, if you're stopping for the night, this place is your entire world. The coaching inn is one of the least romanticized and most genuinely important institutions of the entire era, not least because it was doing something that no previous institution in English life had quite managed. It was providing a standardized service: food, accommodation, horse change mail, handling local information to a constantly rotating population of strangers who had no prior relationship with the place and no reason to return. In many towns, the coaching inn was the largest and most imposing building after the parish church itself, and the innkeeper was a person of considerable local consequence, employer of aulers, grooms, kitchen staff, chambermaids, host to auctions, public meetings, and occasionally theatrical performances, a node through which the news of the country passed daily in both directions. The Georgian Inn at Suck in London, which still exists, and which I would recommend visiting if you ever find yourself in that part of the city, gives you a sense of what these establishments were like at their best. A courtyard surrounded on multiple sides by galleries with the stables at the back and the public rooms arranged around the ground floor. Everything organized for the efficient processing of people and horses, with enough comfort layered on top to justify the price. Let us start with the horses, because the horse yard was the operational heart of every coaching in the inn's profitability, depended in large part on how well it managed its relay horses. A badly run horse yard, animals in poor condition, harness not properly maintained, ostlers too slow, or too few meant late coaches, angry operators and lost business. A well-run one meant the coach changed horses on schedule. The guard ticked the time in his book, and the proprietor maintained his reputation. Behind the inn, and often extending considerably further than the main building, were the stables, long, low structures, stone-floored, smelling permanently of horses and hay, stalls for the relay horses, tack rooms for the harness farrier's equipment for emergency repairs. The head ostler knew every horse in his care by name and temperament, and kept a mental ledger of which animals were rested, and which were tired, and which needed the veterinarian looking at them before the week was out. The records of several surviving coaching in accounts from the 18th and early 19th centuries show the extraordinary logistical complexity this required. One major coaching inn on the Great North Road, the main route running north from London, was simultaneously managing relay horses for multiple different coach services, accommodating overnight guests, supplying meals to stopping passengers, and serving as the local venue for a range of community functions that had nothing to do with coaches at all. Property auctions, militia musters, society meetings, election canvassing, traveling theater companies. All of this happened in the same building that was also managing 60 horses and feeding 100 passing travelers a day. Now, about the food, because this is where 18th century coaching and experience becomes both vivid and occasionally rather alarming. The inn meal at a stage stop was typically quick and simple. A cold joint, some bread, a wedge of cheese, a drink of something hot. 15 minutes. You did not linger. The coach was waiting. If you were staying overnight, the situation was somewhat better, though here the quality varied enormously, depending on the establishment and its proprietor. At the best inns on the major routes, the ones competing for the custom of wealthy travelers on the London Bath or London York Road, the food was genuinely good. Roast meat, fresh vegetables, decent wine puddings. At the worst, you got what the kitchen could assemble in minimum time from whatever happened to be available. A clergyman traveling extensively across England in the second half of the 18th century recorded his meals in his diary with forensic detail. His entries range from genuine satisfaction, a good supper, a comfortable bed, to the kind of tour disappointment that speaks volumes. Chops burnt, dinner bad. Innkeepers of the era understood that the competition for coach custom was real, and that reputation for bad food traveled as fast as a reputation for good food. Whether this pressure was always sufficient to raise standards is, as the clergyman's diary suggests, debatable. A German traveler in England in the early 1780s, the same man who had ridden the coach roof and ended up in the luggage basket, encountered food at English inns that he found not just disappointing, but incomprehensible. He was presented at one establishment with Cheshire cheese roasted before the fire until it was half melted, a local delicacy that was evidently not to everyone's taste. He reported that he could not bring himself to eat it. One imagines the innkeeper's bafflement was equal and opposite. The dining arrangements themselves were socially interesting. Inns did not typically have individual dining rooms for each guest that would come later. Instead, travelers who arrived together or at similar times were often directed to a common table. The innkeeper assigned seats or let guests find their own. This created the same social dynamics as the coach itself, but more so because at the table the hierarchy of inside versus outside passenger temporarily dissolved. Everyone sat together. The clergyman and the merchant, and the livestock dealer and the minor baronet all found themselves around the same board, eating the same food served by the same kitchen. This common table is something worth lingering on. In a society obsessed with knowing exactly who sat above and who sat below, the coach dinner at the inn was one of the few regular occasions in English life where such distinctions were practically difficult to enforce. You could not ask everyone else at the table to please observe your rank while you ate. The situation did not permit it. Some people found this liberating. Others found it deeply uncomfortable. The historical record contains both reactions, and the gap between them says something interesting about the different ways that 18th century people could relate to the enforced democracy of travel. One group that deserves particular attention in the story of the coaching inn, and that tends to be underrepresented in the popular accounts of the era, is the women who ran these establishments. The coaching inn was in most respects a man's world dominated by coachmen, guards, ostlers, and male proprietors. But a significant number of the most successful coaching inns were run by women, particularly widows who had inherited the business from their husbands and proved themselves entirely capable of running it better. The work required to manage a coaching inn without a male partner in a society that provided almost no legal or professional framework for women in business was extraordinary in its demands. You were simultaneously landlord, innkeeper, employer, community leader, and logistics manager. Doing it well and doing it for decades and doing it without scandal required a combination of warmth, firmness, sharp calculation, and genuine skill that no job title in the era adequately captured. There are documented cases of women who ran major coaching inns, and through the reputation and efficiency of their establishments, effectively controlled the coaching traffic through their stretch of road. One such innkeeper operating on the Great North Road between York and the northeast coast in the early 18th century employed multiple postboys in her service and held posting arrangements covering a significant stretch of that critical route. That is not a small business. That is a regional logistics operation managed by one woman in an era when women were not supposed to be managing regional logistics operations. She did not have a business school or a model to follow. She just ran her inn, extended her relationships, and built something substantial. The coaching inn in this, as in many other ways, was more complex and more interesting than the simple nostalgic image suggests. Let me tell you something about Dick Turpin that the movies never will. The horse does not exist. The midnight ride from London to York never happened. The charm, the flowing hair, the courtly manners toward women invented, almost every detail of the Dick Turpin that lives in popular memory was constructed by a novelist named William Harrison Ainsworth in 1834. Almost a century after the real man was hanged in York for stealing horses. And by the time Ainsworth's novel reached the public, enough time had passed that nobody with direct knowledge of the real Turpin was alive to contradict him. The truth when you go looking for it in the actual records, is considerably less romantic. Richard Turpin was baptized in September 1705 in Hempstead, Essex, the fifth of 6 children to a butcher and innkeeper. He trained as a butcher himself, married in his early 20s, and opened a shop in Buckhurst Hill. So far, so unremarkable. A tradesman's son following his father into trade. But things did not go differently. Turpin started dealing in stolen goods for a gang of poachers in the early 1730s, which led to housebreaking, which led to home invasions, which led to something considerably worse. In February 1735, Turpin and his associates, known as the Gregory Gang, carried out a series of brutal home invasions across northeast London. In one attack, they assaulted an elderly farmer, ransacked his house, and carried out acts of violence against him and his servants that no amount of historical distance makes easier to read about. He was not a dashing outlaw robbing a wealthy traveler on a moonlit road. He was a violent criminal attacking elderly people in their homes. I want to be clear about what that was. There was nothing glamorous about any of it. Contemporary witnesses feared him. The only people who romanticized him were those who encountered his legend 100 years later, once the actual fear and violence had safely receded into history. When Turpin was finally hanged at York on the 7th of April, 1739, he had paid men to mourn him at his execution, because without paid mourners, there would have been almost no one there at all. He had no devoted following. He had to hire the grief. That is the real Dick Turpin. And yet, and this is the part that I find genuinely interesting as a question of how human beings make meaning from the past. Within a few decades of his death, the transformation had begun. The process worked like this. A broadsheet was published shortly after his execution, mixing fact and fiction in the way popular crime literature had done for generations. That broadsheet was read and recycled. Local stories attached themselves to his name. And then, in 1834, Ainsworth's novel arrived, and the fiction became so vivid, so appealing, and so widely circulated that it simply swamped the historical record. Ainsworth gave Turpin a noble horse called Black Bess. He gave him the legendary overnight ride from London to York, a feat that had actually been attributed to a different highwayman, John Neverson, decades earlier, and which Ainsworth simply reassigned. He gave him charm, courage, a moral code. He gave him everything the real man conspicuously lacked. What Ainsworth created, and what popular culture has enthusiastically maintained ever since, is a highwayman who embodies a particular fantasy. The rebel who takes from the powerful, who respects women, who faces death with grace. A folk hero of the road. This figure is enormously appealing. He is also as a description of Richard Turpin, essentially a work of fiction. Why does this matter? Not because we should be morally outraged that a violent thief has been turned into a romantic hero. History is full of such transformations, and they are interesting in themselves. It matters because the Turpin myth tells us something important about what the coaching era meant to people who are living through its end. By the 1830s, when Ainsworth was writing The Stagecoach, world was already beginning to feel the pressure of the coming railways. The coaches that had defined English roads for 2 centuries were about to be displaced. And into this moment of transition, the highwayman myth arrived as a kind of compensation. A story about an England that was dangerous and free and romantic, set against roads that were about to be replaced by steam. The real danger of the roads was in fact rather different from the Turpin myth. Highwaymen were a genuine threat from roughly the Restoration period to the late 18th century, the mid-600s to about the 1790s, but their heyday was brief, and their decline was almost entirely unrelated to the railways. The highwayman era ended because of better firearms on coaches, the introduction of professional police forces in London, and eventually elsewhere. The enclosure of common land that had provided refuge and escape routes, and the introduction of banknotes and bills of exchange that made carrying large amounts of cash unnecessary. By the time Ainsworth was romanticizing them, highwaymen were already historical figures. The last notable execution of a highwayman in England was in 1783 when he was hanged. The stagecoach system still had 63 years to run. The mythology arrived 50 years after the reality had ended. The real danger on the coaching roads, particularly in the later 18th and early 19th centuries, was not romantic at all. It was mechanical. Coaches overturned, wheels broke, harness failed, horses stumbled or bolted. And when any of these things happened at speed on a road with no barriers, the results could be catastrophic. Contemporary newspapers and traveler accounts are full of coach accidents. Some reported with detached brevity, some with the kind of detail that makes clear the journalists were writing for an audience that understood exactly how it felt to be in a fast-moving coach when something went wrong. Overturns were the most common serious accident, and the most serious consequences usually fell on the outside passengers who had no wooden walls between themselves and the road. A passenger named Charles Latrobe, traveling in the mid-1830s, described surviving a coach accident in terms that strip away any remaining romance. A wheel gave way at the top of a hill, and the coach went over into a ditch. He walked away. Not everyone always did. The structural vulnerabilities of the coach were well understood by operators and drivers. The thorough braces, the thick leather straps that supported the body of the coach, were under constant stress and required regular inspection. The wheels, subjected to the same jolting road surfaces as everything else, could lose their iron tires without warning. An experienced coachman watched his vehicle the way a sailor watches the rigging constantly, because the consequences of missing something were serious. It is this real danger, structural, mechanical, probabilistic, that the historical record shows as the actual threat to coach passengers, not masked riders on moonlit heaths. The road itself, the vehicle itself, the physics of speed and weight and impact on surfaces that were rarely as good as they needed to be. Which brings us to something worth saying directly. The fact that the coaching era functioned as well as it did for as long as it did was not a given. It was an achievement built on roads that were inadequate, with vehicles that were imperfect by drivers who were skilled, but human-carrying passengers who accepted a level of risk that most people today would consider unacceptable. And they did it millions of times. The horror stories exist, and they are real. But the vastly greater number of journeys were completed without incident, year after year, decade after decade, because the people who ran this system were very good at what they did, and because the horses and the ostlers and the innkeepers and the road builders had built something that within its limitations worked. That is the dark side of the road, not a dashing highwayman on a black horse, just the daily, unglamorous, occasionally fatal reality of moving people and letters across a country that was not yet ready for the speed being asked of it. Fiera in the afternoon, August 2nd, 1784. Bristol. A coach sits waiting outside the Rama Tavern, packed and ready, the horses restless in their harness. It looks from the outside like any other stagecoach. It carries the same passengers, travels the same roads. But something about this particular departure is different. The man who organized it has been arguing with government bureaucrats for 2 years to make it happen. He has funded it entirely out of his own pocket. And when it rolls out of Bristol and starts the long overnight road toward London, it is carrying something that none of the other coaches on that road are carrying. It is carrying a new idea about what a country could be. The man who organized that coach was named John Palmer, and his background is one of those biographical details that seems almost too neat to be real. Palmer was born in Bath in 1742, the son of a brewer and theater owner. He inherited his father's theater in Bath, and eventually managed a second one in Bristol, the first two theaters outside London to receive a royal patent. To move his actors' stage hands and props rapidly between the two cities, Palmer had developed a fast, reliable coach service running between Bristol and Bath, a theater manager solving a logistics problem. That is where one of the most consequential ideas in British postal history came from. Not from a postmaster, not from a government reformer, from a man who needed to get his actors from one stage to another before the evening's curtain. And what Palmer noticed, the insight that made everything else possible, was deceptively simple. The existing postal system had been moving letters at about 6 mph here in daylight, only with minimal security since the mid-7th century. Palmer knew from running his own coach service that you could do considerably better than that. He demonstrated this in the plainest possible way. A letter sent from Bath by official post on a Monday afternoon arrived in London late on Tuesday, or sometimes not until Wednesday. A letter sent at exactly the same time on a private coach arrived by Tuesday morning. The post was being beaten by commercial coaches in its own era on its own roads. Palmer took this comparison, combined it with a formal proposal for a guarded, far-scheduled mail coach service, and walked into the corridors of government with it. He met immediate resistance. The General Post Office opposed his plan with the institutional conviction of an organization that has done something the same way for over a century, and considers that a sufficient argument for continuing. Post office officials argued the existing system could not be meaningfully improved. They were not interested in input from a theater manager. Palmer went around them. He secured an audience with the younger William Pitt, who had recently become Prime Minister and was interested in any proposal that might increase government revenue. Mail-generated fees. A faster, more reliable mail service would generate more of them. Pitt authorized a trial. That trial was the coach that left Bristol on the evening of August 2nd, 1784. The journey that had previously taken up to 38 hours under the old system arrived in London in 16, more than halved in a single run. The local Bristol newspaper reported the event with evident excitement, describing the new mail coach and its smart new livery. No longer a shabby cart and its postboy, but a proper vehicle carrying the dignity of the Royal Mail from an old cart and a ragged boy. That phrase captures the transformation vividly. Within weeks, the post office extended the service. Within months, it was running on multiple routes across the country. Within a few years, it had replaced the old postboy system almost entirely. The design of the Royal Mail coach that emerged from this transformation was striking enough to become, in visual terms, an emblem of the nation itself. The upper body was painted black. The door panels were painted maroon, and each bore the royal coat of arms in full heraldic detail. The wheels were bright red. The whole effect was of something formal, proud and purposeful, not merely a conveyance, but a statement about the authority of the institution it represented. The coachmen who drove the mail coaches wore a distinctive uniform. The guards, who were post office employees, not contracted from the coaching companies, wore scarlet coats with brass buttons and carried a brass horn. The horn served a specific and legally enforced function. When a mail coach approached a toll gate, the guard was required to sound it, and the toll keeper was required to open the gate immediately without charging a toll. The mail did not pay tolls, and anyone who delayed it faced a substantial fine. At many gates, 40 shillings. $2 was the penalty for failing to open at the sound of the horn. That was a significant sum for a gatekeeper in 1784, and it ensured that the sound of the mail guard's horn was taken seriously. That horn call, heard every day on every route across the entire country, was the sound of a national system insisting on its own priority. Think about what that represented. Before the mail coach era, every town kept its own local time. The sun reached its highest point at slightly different moments across the width of England, and local clocks were set accordingly. London noon was several minutes earlier than Bristol noon, which was several minutes earlier than Exit noon. This was not a problem when nothing moved faster than a horse, because no one needed to coordinate time precisely across distances. The mail coach changed that. A coach leaving London at 8 in the evening was expected to arrive in Exat at a specific hour the following morning, and the post office published those times and held to them. For this to work, everyone along the route needed to agree on what time it was. The arrival of the mail coach became effectively a national clock. People set their watches by it. Towns synchronized to it. For the first time in British history, the country was living on something approaching a shared schedule. Not just the same time, but the same timetable. News from London could be known in Bath by breakfast. The letters that went out on the evening mail could be read the next morning in Bristol. The country was not just connected, it was synchronized. There is one figure from the mail guard world that I want to give a moment to because his story captures something important about the human dimension of this system. His name was Moses Nobbs, and his career stretched from the mid-1830s through to the early 1890s, a working life that began on mail coaches and ended on railway mail trains, spanning the full arc of the transformation described in this series. He rode through the night in all seasons, with a locked box of letters at his back for more than 50 years. He began in a world where a letter traveled at 10 days to Menpisur, and ended in one where the same letter traveled at 60. He witnessed the end of the coaching era from the inside, and adapted to what came after it. He is not famous. He did not write a memoir. But the fact that his record exists at all, that someone noted his name, his route, the span of his service, tells us something about how the people who ran this system were valued by those who depended on them. The mail guard, in the end, is perhaps the figure who best captures what the Royal Mail Coach represented. Not the coachman celebrated, tipped his skill, visible and admired, not the passengers complaining, enduring, occasionally grateful, but the guard, sitting alone at the back of the coach, in the dark, in the cold, with his locked box and his schedule, and his horn and his responsibility to arrive. The post had to get through. That was not a metaphor. That was the actual requirement of the job built into the contract enforceable by law. The guard knew it when he took the post. He stayed on the box anyway for the same reason that people in all eras stay at their post, because someone has to. And because being the person who does it reliably year after year turns out to be its own form of meaning. The system that Palmer built did not run on genius alone. It ran on that. There is something almost unbearably poignant about the way the Stagecoach era ended, not with a slow fade, not with a dignified retirement, but with a kind of sudden free fall. The world Britain had spent 2 centuries building, with its coaching inns and its horse hierarchies, and its aulers, and its coachman dynasties, and its mail guards freezing loyally on their boxes, was not gradually phased out. It was made irrelevant within roughly a single decade, and the people who lived through it were not given much time to adjust. To understand what happened and why it happened so fast, we need to go back to one specific morning. September 15th, 1830. Liverpool. The opening day of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway was planned as a triumph. 8 trains. The Duke of Wellington as the centerpiece guest. He was Prime Minister at the time. Thousands of spectators lining the tracks. Commemorative medals struck in advance. There was a genuine sense among the organizers that they were doing something historic, and they were right. They just had not quite anticipated the form the history would take. A 20-year-old actress who had been given a preview ride on the line a few weeks earlier wrote a letter to a friend describing what it felt like to travel at 35 faster, she noted, than a bird in flight. They had actually measured this by running a test alongside a snipe. She described the sensation of speed in terms of pure astonishment. The wind, the blur of the landscape, the feeling of inhabiting a form of movement that nothing in her previous experience had prepared her for. 35 an hour, miles, the fastest any stagecoach ever managed on a good road, with exceptional horses on a straight flat stretch, was perhaps 12. This was not an improvement. This was a different category of experience. Another passenger on the same demonstration ride had a less lyrical response. He was frightened. The noise, enormous and closed, reverberating, was unlike anything he had encountered. Some people found it exhilarating. Some found it terrifying. Almost everyone found it completely unlike anything they had known. Before the railway opened, there have been genuine fears expressed by people who were not being ridiculous that it would be impossible to breathe while traveling at such speeds, or that passengers' eyes would be damaged by the motion. Eminent scientists had worried about livestock near the tracks being permanently disturbed. We can laugh at that now. But those fears tell us something true. No one had a framework for this yet. The stagecoach, for all its discomforts, operated at speeds the human body understood intuitively. The railway was something entirely outside that register. The opening ceremony itself turned tragic almost immediately. Among the dignitaries present was William Huskinson, the Member of Parliament for Liverpool, who had done as much as anyone to get the railway built. At a scheduled water stop partway along the route, most passengers were told to remain aboard, but around 50 dignitaries got down, drawn by the festive atmosphere. Huskin saw the Duke of Wellington and moved toward him to attempt a political reconciliation. A warning was called that an engine was approaching on the adjacent track. Others managed to move clear. Huskersonen, who was recovering from recent surgery, panicked. He grabbed the door of Wellington's carriage, which was wider than the gap between the two trains. The locomotive struck the door and pulled him under. He was rushed to the nearest town by train with George Stephenson himself at the controls, but died that evening. The official memorial erected at the site of the accident described the moment in terms that captured the full weight of the occasion. A triumph of science and genius had been turned in an instant into something else entirely. There was discussion about cancelling the remainder of the day's proceedings. Enormous crowds were waiting in Manchester, and concerns about public order convinced the organizers to continue. The trains completed their journey subdued, and the next day the railway opened to the public. In its first week, it carried over 6,000 ticketed passengers. Within a month, the daily numbers were 4 times what the operators had projected. Whatever had happened at the water stop, the public was ready. Think about what that meant for the stagecoach. The journey between Liverpool and Manchester by the new railway took 2 hours. It cost half the price of the stagecoach on the same route. 2 hours, half the price. If you were a coach operator running between those two cities in October 1830, you were already out of business. You just might not have fully accepted it yet. Most stagecoach companies operating on that route closed within months of the railway opening. It was simply impossible to compete. Not difficult, not challenging. Impossible. No one was going to pay more money to travel more slowly in worse conditions. And here is what strikes me most when I think about this. The stagecoach industry at its peak in 1830 was not some marginal enterprise. It was a massive interconnected economic system that had been building for 2 centuries. Every coaching route required horses, dozens of them per stage. Every stage required an inn. Every inn required ostlers, stablemen, cooks, chambermaids, harness makers, friars. The network of people whose livelihoods depended on the coach continuing to run was enormous. A local historian writing about the aftermath of the railway's arrival in one major coaching town on the road north from London, described the collapse in terms that have stayed with me. He wrote about the coaches disappearing one by one, the old inns beginning to close, the harness makers and farriers finding their trade gone. He called it a tragedy, not merely for the coachmen and their families, but for the whole texture of a community that had organized itself around the coaching traffic. A tragedy, not a transition, not progress, a tragedy. Do you ever wonder about the human scale of a technological disruption? Not the grand narrative. The railways transformed Britain. Yes, obviously. But the individual people standing on the wrong side of that transformation when it happened. The coachmen were not easily retrained for anything the railway offered. Some became guards on trains carrying their sense of schedule and responsibility into the new era. The records of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway note that some of its early guards came directly from the stagecoach trade, competent, experienced, and looking for work. Others simply could not find a place in the new world. Men who had spent 20 years mastering the four-in-hand found that mastery had no market value in a world of iron rails and steam engines. The horses themselves are in their way the saddest part of the whole story. Thousands upon thousands of animals had been bred specifically for coach work. The right build, the right temperament, the right training. When the coaches stopped running, those horses became surplus. The market for coach horses collapsed. Many were sold into heavy labor or worse. The speed of the collapse once it began was almost fatiguous. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway carried well over 400,000 passengers in its first year, a figure that dwarfed anything the stagecoach routes had ever managed. Between 1825 and 1835, Parliament passed 54 acts authorizing new railway construction. By 1838, the railway between London and Birmingham had opened. By the mid-1840s, a traveler could go from Manchester to London in 8 hours a journey that had taken the best stagecoaches 80 hours just a decade earlier. 80 hours to 8. The stagecoach had not been outpaced. It had been rendered prehistoric. By the early 1840s, most London-based coach services had been withdrawn. Some clung on in the remoter parts of Wales and the Scottish Highlands, where the railway had not yet arrived doing the work. The coach had always done best connecting the places the larger world had not yet reached. But on the main routes, the arteries of England that had hummed with horn calls and galloping horses for 200 years, it was over. The last regular mail coach, service from London, the route to Norwich, ran its final journey on January 6, 1846. 15 years after the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened, the mail coach network was finished. Some of the guards found their way onto railway mail trains. The same loyalty to schedule, the same locked box of letters, just pulled by iron instead of horses. Here is what I find genuinely interesting about this moment, though, and it is something the straightforward narrative of progress tends to skip over. The people who had lived the coaching age did not all feel they had been improved. Many felt something had been taken. What was being mourned was not just inconvenience or lost income. It was a particular relationship with the world, with landscape, with pace, with the people you encountered on a journey. The stagecoach had been slow enough that you experienced the ground between places. You passed through villages rather than under them. You watched the weather change, heard the dialect shift, felt the hills in your legs when you got out to walk them. A man who rode from London to Edinburgh by coach in 1820 New England, in a way that a man who covered the same distance by train in 1850 simply did not. And yet the railway carried hundreds of thousands of passengers in its first year on a single route. The public voted overwhelmingly and immediately with its money. Whatever was being lost, and something genuine was being lost. People wanted what was being gained more. that tension sits at the heart of the Stagecoach era's ending, and I think it sits at the heart of something more universal about the way we move through history. We rarely lose things cleanly. We trade them. And sometimes what we trade them for is so clearly better, so faster and cheaper, and more available to more people, that we tend to remember only the gain and let the loss go quiet. Which brings us to a question worth sitting with. What exactly did the Stagecoach era leave behind? Not in history books, in the language you still speak, the roads you still drive, the way you still think about what it means to go somewhere and to have been somewhere. That is where we are going next. Something funny happens when a world ends. The people who live through it start to miss it in ways they never expected, and often in ways that seem to surprise even themselves. The same traveler who had spent 20 years complaining about the cold, the mud, the jolting roads, and the indignity of being forced to walk up steep hills to spare the horses, suddenly found sitting in a comfortable railway carriage that something was gone that he could not quite name. The speed was better, the price was lower, the weather did not touch him. And yet it is worth pausing here because the legacy of the Stagecoach era is not simply what it built: the roads, the inns, the postal networks. It is also what it burned into the imagination of a culture so deeply that the echoes are still audible today, nearly 2 centuries later. Let us start with a man who perhaps did more than anyone to shape how we think about the coaching age. Not a coachman or a traveler, but a writer. A young journalist who had ridden these coaches through the early 1830s, when they were still running in full force, and who began writing a novel in 1836 that would almost accidentally become the great elegy of a world about to vanish. Charles Dickens published the Pickwick Papers in serial form from 1836 to 1837. The novel is set between 1827 and 1831, the final years before the railway arrived. And as Dickens was writing it, the coaching world he was describing was being rapidly destroyed by the new railroads. An air of nostalgia hangs over the whole book. What Dickens did in the Pickwick Papers was remarkable for its timing. He was writing about a world that was still technically present but already feeling like the past. Several coach journeys are described with exhilaration, anticipation, and affection. Dickens felt pride in their speed and regularity, and he felt warmth for the colorful coachmen and the rituals of the road. That affection was real. But what makes it interesting is that Dickens was recording something in the very act of loving it. The way a photographer reaches for a camera when something beautiful is about to be gone. Throughout his later novels, Dickens used the stagecoach as a way of backdating his stories. Having characters ride in coaches, even in novels set in a period when the railway had already arrived. Using the coach to create a sense of an older pre-industrial Britain. This was a deliberate artistic choice, and it was enormously influential. The Pickwickian England of good inns, colorful coachmen, snowy roads, and cheerful passengers became, through the power of Dickens' imagination, the template for how Victorian Britain and eventually the whole English-speaking world chose to remember the era. It is worth knowing that this memory was already partly a myth when Dickens created it. The real coaching inns were not uniformly warm and cheerful. The real coachmen were not always jovial figures dispensing wisdom from the box seat. The real roads were, as we have established, frequently catastrophic. Dickens knew this. He had ridden these coaches himself, and he had reported on their conditions as a journalist. But nostalgia does not require accuracy. It requires feeling. The most extraordinary literary meditation on what the coaching era actually meant, however, came from a less expected source. Thomas De Quincey, the essayist perhaps best known for his confessional writing about his experiences with opium, published an essay on the mail coach experience in 1849. He called it the English Mail Coach. It appeared in a literary magazine, and it is one of the strangest and most beautiful pieces of prose that the coaching era produced. De Quincey had traveled on the mail coaches as a student at Oxford, and had habitually ridden outside by choice against the pressure of social convention that said educated young men should sit inside. He had loved the exposure, the speed, the night air, the sense of being part of the machine, and by the time he wrote about it, the railways had already displaced everything he was describing. The essay is both a celebration and an elegy. In its first section, which he titled The Glory of Motion, De Quincey described the sensation of riding the mail at speed on a clear night, the darkness rushing past the horses at full stretch, the guard's horn calling at toll gates, the knowledge that across the whole country the same scene was repeating simultaneously on dozens of routes. He described it as a form of transport that communicated the strength of the nation to itself, not just moving letters, enacting something, a shared confidence, a national pulse. By 1849, that pulse had stopped. The mail coach, which had seemed terrifyingly fast in 1785, was now a symbol of a slower, more human world. The thing that had once represented the cutting edge of speed had been overtaken so completely that it now stood for tranquility. The coach had become within a single lifetime an object of nostalgia. But the legacy of the stagecoach, as I said, goes considerably deeper than literature and sentiment. It is embedded in the actual physical geography of Britain in ways that most people drive over every day without noticing. The route of the A1, the major road running north from London, through the East Midlands to Yorkshire and on to Edinburgh, follows the line of the old Great North Road almost exactly. The same road that coaches traveled in the 18th century is the road that lorries and cars travel today, with periodic modernizations layered on top of the original route. The coaching era gave Britain a network of roads whose basic geography persisted through the automotive age, because roads like rivers tend to stay where they are once they have been established. Along the routes of the old coaching roads, you can still find physical evidence of the era. The inn buildings with their wide arch gateways designed to admit a loaded coach. The high streets of market towns that are notably wider at their centers than elsewhere widened during the coaching era to accommodate the traffic that passed through. The George at Stamford, the Angel at Grantham, the White Hart at Newark. These buildings are still standing still, serving food and drink, still offering beds to travelers now arriving by car rather than coach, but following roads whose basic alignment has not fundamentally changed in 200 years. The stagecoach also left its mark on the English language in ways that we use constantly, without thinking about their origin. The phrase riding shotgun, meaning sitting in the front passenger seat of a vehicle, comes directly from the coaching era. It referred to the armed guard or messenger who sat beside the driver to protect valuable cargo, particularly on routes in the American West where stage robbery was a genuine risk. The phrase entered common use through popular fiction about the frontier West in the early 20th century, but its roots go back to the practice that was already standard on English mail coaches a century earlier. The word stage itself, as used in dozens of modern contexts. Stage of a journey, stage of a process. Stage in a theater carries in every usage the echo of the original meaning, a section of road between two relay points where horses were changed. When we say something is happening in stages, we're without knowing it, invoking the rhythm of a horse being changed every 10 to 15 miles on a Georgian road. Even the phrase all aboard, still used by railway announcers, ship officers, and anyone trying to gather a group before departure, came from the coaching world, specifically from the coachman's call when the horses were fresh and the passengers needed to be in their seats. The clock at the end gate would show the hour the coachman would shout, and those who were not yet aboard would have to run. The stage, the schedule, the guard, the booking, the route, the connection. These are all words with specific technical coaching era, meanings that have spread outward into general use and lost their origins entirely. The language of modern travel, including air travel, rail travel, everything that came after is built in large part on vocabulary that the coaching era created. And then there is the institutional legacy. The Royal Mail is the direct descendant of the Palmer system now, more than 2 centuries old. The hotel industry, with its standardized rooms, its booking systems, its provision of food and beds to strangers on a commercial basis, traces its modern form directly back to the coaching inn. The railway station, when it arrived, was designed around the same set of traveler needs that the coaching inn had been meeting for generations somewhere: to wait somewhere, to eat somewhere, to store luggage, somewhere to find out when the next departure was. The stagecoach era invented, or at least profoundly shaped, the infrastructure of the traveler's world that all subsequent forms of transport have inherited. Everything that came after the railway, the road network, the postal service, the hotel industry, the newspaper distributed nationally on a single day, was built on foundations that the coaching era laid. The coaching age created the expectation that you could go somewhere on a schedule, that someone would look after your horse or your car, your luggage, your needs while you were there, and that the experience of travel was something that could be organized reliably by people whose job it was to do that organizing. Those expectations are so fundamental to how we travel today that we rarely notice them. They were not always there. The coaching era put them there. Imagine you're sitting in a wooden box with 5 strangers: a wool merchant from Bristol, a widow traveling north to a funeral, a young man making his first journey to London, who's not said a word for 3 hours because he is too overwhelmed to know what to say. You've been traveling since before dawn. It is now past midday. You are cold, slightly dusty, somewhat hungry, and your back hurts in a way that suggests it will remember this journey for several days. You have 12 hours to go. And here is the question I want to sit with in this final part. What does this journey teach you? Not just about the history of transportation, about us. About what we lose when we stop having to endure things together. The quality I keep coming back to, looking at the whole coaching era, is something I can only call the quality of slowness. At its peak in the 1820s, the fastest mail coaches on the best roads in England were traveling at around 10 to 12 miles an hour. That was genuinely fast by the standards of the era. It was speed that felt like speed that startled observers, that required skill and nerve from the coachman, but it was also slow enough to mean something. Slow enough that you experienced the ground you were crossing. Slow enough that the miles registered as miles, not as a blur between departure and arrival. Washington Irving, the American writer perhaps best known for the legend of Sleepy Hollow, spent time in England in the early 19th century and wrote a beautiful account of a Christmas Eve journey by stagecoach through Yorkshire. He described it not as an ordeal, though it had all the elements of one, but as something richer, a forced encounter with a particular texture of a winter landscape, the frosted fields, the dim villages, the brief warmth of each stage stop before returning to the cold, the strangers he had not chosen and could not avoid. Irving's insight was that the enforced presence of the journey, the impossibility of simply checking out, putting on headphones, and treating the hours between here and there as dead time, was not a deprivation. It was a form of attention. You had to be there fully in the cold and the dark and the inconvenience of it. And in being there, you noticed things you would never have noticed if you'd been moving faster. The coachman, Irving observed, was not just a driver, but a local authority. Someone who knew the particular character of each stretch of road, the families and the farms visible from it, the history embedded in the landscape at walking pace distance. His knowledge was not the broad, shallow knowledge of someone who has looked everything up. It was the deep, specific, embodied knowledge of someone who has driven the same road hundreds of times in every season. Distance in the coaching world was real. It was felt. The 200 between London and Edinburgh were not a number on a screen. They were experienced physically as a cumulative weight of hours and discomfort, and passage through identifiably different places. What this produced in the coaching era was a particular relationship to the other people making the same journey. You had not chosen them. You could not avoid them. And the shared experience of discomfort, the same ruts, the same cold, the same smoky fires at the same stage, stops had a democratizing effect that no amount of formal social theory could have engineered. The historian John Copeland, writing about coaching-era social dynamics, observed that the coaching inn was one of the few institutions in Georgian England that operated in practice without a fixed hierarchy based on birth. A merchant and an earl could be stranded by the same snowstorm and assigned beds by the same innkeeper in the same order of arrival, not because George in England had ceased to care about social rank. It very much had not, but because the practical requirements of the coach system made strict hierarchy temporarily unenforceable. What the inn offered was the first modern institution that treated strangers as having an equal claim on the same space, not as a principle, not as an ideology, but as a practical necessity. There were 8 inside seats, or 20 beds, or 200 meals a day to be provided, and they went to whoever was there and could pay. Birth was neither here nor there when the coach was leaving at 6:00 in the morning. Now, I want to be careful here about the nostalgia trap. The coaching era was not better than what came after it. The railway gave ordinary people a degree of mobility, safety, and affordability that the coach never achieved. The average working-class family who in the coaching era could rarely afford even an outside seat on a long journey could after 1850 travel in a railway third-class carriage for a few shillings and arrive in hours rather than days. That was a genuine, substantial improvement in human freedom. And the Internet, for all that it has flattened experience into a screen, has connected people across distances that the coaching era could not have imagined. The letter that took 10 days to cross England in 1750 now travels the same distance in a fraction of a second. That is not nothing. That is in many ways extraordinary. But it is worth asking the question honestly, what have we traded? And do we fully understand the terms of the trade? The United Kingdom appointed a minister for loneliness in 2018. This is something that would have been incomprehensible to a Georgian traveler who spent long journeys pressed against strangers, in a wooden box sharing food and warmth, and the particular intimacy of shared inconvenience. We are not less connected in any technical sense than people in the 18th century. We are more connected to more people across greater distances with less friction. And yet, the casual, unplanned, unavoidable encounter, the connection that is inflicted rather than chosen, has become increasingly rare. We have the technology to choose exactly who we hear from, exactly what we see, exactly when we engage. We have designed frictionlessness into the experience of movement and communication, and it turns out that friction was doing something. The philosopher Alan Debott has written about the paradox of modern travel, that the greatest threat to a meaningful journey is not the discomfort of the trip, but the ease with which we bring our own world with us. We pack our routines into our devices, our preferred content into our headphones, and we arrive at the destination, having moved our body through space while barely inhabiting the space between. The stagecoach did not allow this. It made you be somewhere in the cold, in the noise, in the company of people you had not chosen, in a landscape that was moving past you, at a speed you could actually register. And that slowness, that impossibility of opting out, was in its own uncomfortable way a form of encounter with the world as it actually is. Here is what I find worth thinking about. The connections we did not choose often shape us most. The journeys we could not rush tend to be the ones we remember. The strangers who had nowhere else to sit but next to us for 12 hours in a jolting box on a bad road. Those are sometimes the conversations that stay. Let me close with a moment. January 6th, 1846. A Tuesday evening, Norwich. The last mail coach is being loaded. The guard in his scarlet coat lifts his brass horn. The coachman takes up his res. The horses lean into the harness, and the coach moves out of the inn-yard and into the dark. There were no speeches, no commemorations. It was not understood at that moment to be a final departure. It became one, route by route. Over the following weeks and months, the remaining services were withdrawn. The coaches put into storage, the horses sold on the guards redeployed or dismissed. The network simply became gradually and without ceremony unnecessary. Somewhere in England that night, in a stable or at a coaching inn, or sitting beside a fire in a house that had been built and paid for by 30 years of coaching work, there was someone who understood what was ending, not progress, not the future, but something specific and human and gone. The stagecoach world made Britain connected. It made travel possible for people for whom it had never been possible. It moved letters and newspapers and goods and ordinary people across a country that had barely moved before. And it did all of this at a speed that required you to be present for the doing of it, to experience the distance as distance to arrive somewhere, knowing you had actually traveled there. That is what I will carry from this story. Not the romantic image, not the gleaming coaches on Christmas cards, not the dashing highwayman, but the actual thing. The horse changed in 3 minutes in the cold. The guard on his box in January. The strangers who shared a bench for 12 hours and arrived somewhere together changed slightly by the having gone. Thank you for traveling this road with me. All 12 parts of it. If any part of this story stayed with you, if something surprised you or moved you or made you think about something you had not thought about before, I would genuinely love to hear it in the comments. This series was built on curiosity, and your curiosity keeps it going. There is another story coming, a different era, a different kind of human ambition, a discovery that changed everything for the world that came after it. And I think, if you are here, you're exactly the kind of person who will want to know it.